Okay, so to start with, this will work. There. North America's birds are in crisis. We lost over 3 billion birds since 1970. If you look at this graph here, you can see grassland birds are the hardest hit. And we've lost over half of the grassland birds over the last 50 years. So of those 3 billion, around 750,000 of those were grassland birds. So grassland birds obviously aren't doing too well. And we know the main reason for this is habitat loss. Overall, North American grasslands have declined by around 64%. And eastern tallgrass prairie, like where Manhattan is, has declined by even more, by around 86%. And so overall, there's less habitat available for birds to live in. And this is causing most of these declines. But in ecology, there's really just a single explanation for a pattern that we're seeing. And so what else might be driving these declines besides just habitat loss? It's important to remember that not all the habitat that we do have left is the same quality. Some habitat can support more birds than others. It's also important to remember that these birds are highly mobile, and especially at local scales, emigration is probably very important in addition to differences in survival. And we know local populations are declining from a lot of previous work in several songbirds and prairie chickens and ducks. These local populations are declining. And so obviously this can't just be due to habitat loss, because even at these single sites where the total amount of habitat is fairly stable over time, we're still seeing these declines. And so this is one of the goals of my master's research. I wanted to focus on a single site at really long spatial scales and try to see if reductions in fecundity over time could explain these declines. And second, I wanted to focus on a really large spatial scale at around a decade to see how weather and movement could explain differences in local abundance between sites. And so now I can go into my first chapter, explain the long-term trends in the reproductive biology of breeding birds at Konza Prairie. If you're not familiar with Konza Prairie, I know a lot of people are, but some of you aren't. It's a tallgrass prairie site in northeast Kansas, just south of Manhattan, where a lot of us are right now. And it's divided up into several individual watershed units, each of which is managed with a different grazing regime. So they can be, you can see here, these reddish-orange ones are grazed by bison, the green ones are grazed by cattle, and the blue ones are ungrazed. And they're also managed with different burning regimes. So you can be burned everywhere from every year, all the way up to only once every 20 years. And the combination of these burning and grazing regimes result in a complex mosaic of different habitat types at Konza. And this mosaic of habitat types has been studied as a long-term ecological research site since 1980, and has been host to a lot of ornithologists, including some you may recognize. So we've had John Zimmerman, Jim Rivers, Elmer Fink, Brett Sandercock, Paige Klug, Bill Jensen, and Alice Boyle, and hopefully you all at least recognize the last one. And in addition, these researchers have studied a lot of different grassland birds on Konza. So over 200 species have been observed on Konza, and over 60 of these have been observed breeding on Konza. And each of these species have different habitat requirements that like different burning and grazing regimes. So all these species here on the right, like areas that are a little shrubbier and are not burned or grazed as frequently. Whereas these grassland specialists need this like pristine grassland without this woody encroachment. And woody encroachment is when you start out with fairly natural prairie with a lot of grass and a few shrubs or trees. And over time, if you suppress those disturbances and there's not enough burning or grazing going on, these woody plants can start to expand and they'll start to shade out those grasses. And there's also this kind of feedback loop where in a natural system, you might have big hot fires because of all this dead grass fuel. When you start to shade out those grasses, the fires aren't as big and can't clear out those woody plants as well. And so there's this positive feedback loop happening. And when that feedback loop gets severe enough, you could eventually have a conversion of the grassland to shrublands or even forests. And this can degrade the grassland habitat for species who need that pristine grassland on the left there. And this can be bad for birds in a number of ways. It can increase the risk of brown-headed cowbird parasitism. So these are brood parasites that lay their eggs in other birds' nests. If you look at this picture here, you can see these two big cowbird eggs below for the host eggs above. And importantly, when cowbirds lay an egg in a bird's nest, they also remove a host egg. And so more cowbirds could lead to declines for the species. And more woody encroachment can also lead to an increase in nest predators because they have more places to hide and to seek out those nests. And we know woody encroachment is happening on Konza. So if you focus on this central area here, where these blue ones are ungrazed and these red ones are grazed, and the darker ones are burned less frequently. And if you look at a satellite image of those from 1978, if you look at these little green patches, these are the woody plants there. So you can see there are some woody plants on Konza in the 70s, but if you're familiar with Konza, you know this is mostly in riparian zones where you'd expect to see a lot of woody plants. But if you look at a satellite image of the same place from around 30 years later in 2010, you can see there's much more woody plant cover. And it's especially severe in this area up here and this one down here. And if you look really closely, you can see 20s here. That's because both of these watersheds are only burned once every 20 years. And it's even worse in this northern area, which is also ungrazed. And so where you have the least amount of disturbance, you have the most severe woody encroachment. And so I wanted to see how this woody encroachment might explain these population declines. So again, we know the major cause of these declines is habitat loss, but how could this habitat degradation through woody encroachment also cause these declines? Like I mentioned before, it could cause an increase in predators, which could then result in increasing complete predation, which is when a predator eats everything that's in a nest and that nest fails because the predator ate everything. And so that could pretty directly cause population declines because there aren't any young left to carry on the next generation. Or it could increase partial predation rates, which is when a predator eats some but not all of the eggs or the young in a nest. And this could obviously result in a reduction of cleft size, so the number of eggs that are in a nest, the number of those eggs that survive to hatch, or the number of those young that survive to fledge or to leave the nest. And through that, lead to these population declines. So that's one way in which this woody encroachment could cause declines. The other one is through an increase in cowbirds. Like I said, cowbirds tend to like places that are scrubbier. And so we expect more cowbirds with more woody encroachment. And this could cause increases in either the frequency of root parasitism or how many nests are parasitized at all, and the intensity of this parasitism, which is how many eggs these cowbirds are laying in each nest. And again, since these cowbirds remove a host egg when they lay eggs in a host nest, this could also result in decreases in clutch size, the number of eggs hatched, or the number of young fledged, and therefore lead to population declines. And so I had several hypotheses based on this for how woody encroachment could lead to these declines. In addition, again, when habitat degradation is severe enough, it can lead to habitat loss. So I had several hypotheses. First, that fecundity would decrease over time. And so again, this is the number of eggs that are laid in the nest, the number of those eggs that survive to hatch, or the number of those young that survive to fledge. Second, that these within nest drivers of these declines might increase. So we might have more predation or more root parasitism over time. And third, that these changes would correlate with the population trends that we're seeing. So species whose populations are declining are going to be the ones who are seeing these reductions of fecundity, these increases in predation and parasitism, and vice versa. Next, that these changes would correlate with woody encroachment. So if woody encroachment is causing declines, we expect the most severe declines where there is woody encroachment. And last, that this would be the worst for these grassland specialists that need pristine grassland without these woody plants in there. And so to test this, I used nest data from 1971 to 2020. This was around 6,300 nests in 48 species. And obviously I didn't collect all this data myself because this started over 20 years before I was born. So this includes over 10 projects from over 30 of those researchers that I mentioned before. And to give you a quick overview of what these data look like, look at this figure with year on the x-axis and each species in the nest data set on the y. And if there's a square for a species in a given year, it means I have nest data for that species in that year. And the lighter blue the square is, the more data I have. And so you can see there's pretty good coverage overall. There is this gap in the mid-90s, but overall it's pretty good temporal spread and a good range of species for each year. And another note, this data set will be made available on the Konza data portal after I publish this stuff, and will be available for future research. So this isn't just useful for my project. This can be useful for a range of different projects in the future. Next, I also needed to figure out which species have increased or decreased on Konza. And to do that, I used data from line-transect surveys that have been done over 40 years. And I fit a linear model using those data with a year by species interaction. And I accounted for effort by including the total distance sampled in each year in these models. And from those, I could get beta values and confidence intervals for each species. I could put those onto a plot with these beta values on the y-axis and each species on the x. And so I would get these point estimates with these error bars around them. And if those error bars overlap 0, that species is stable. It's not changing over time. If they're below 0, it's decreasing. And if they're above 0, it's increasing. And so using these data, I could figure out which species are changing over time on Konza and how. And next, using those nest data and these trends that I calculated, I fit generalized linear mixed models. I included a linear year term in all models to look at changes across years. I included a random affected species in all models because I was interested in overall trends, not species-specific trends. And I had several model sets. So first I tested if fecundity has gone down over time, or if these within nest drivers like predation or parasitism have gone up. Next, I tested if those changes were related to those population trends by using a year-by trend interaction as my predictor. And then I tested some nest location-specific drivers of wood encroachment. So I used the frequency of fire and grazing at each of these nest sites to see if wood encroachment is driving these changes that we're seeing. And lastly, I included species-level habitat use, like their preferred breeding habitat and nest substrate. And so using these data, I could look at these species trends, and you can see most of these species are stable, meaning that these confidence intervals overlap 0. So 28 of my 48 species were stable, including Great Plai chickens. 9 of them were increasing, including brown-headed cowbirds. And, sorry, 2 times. And then 11 of them were decreasing, including one of my personal favorites, Grasshopper Sparrows. And if you kind of delve into this data a little bit more, there's some interesting trends that we see. So first, the species with the sharpest increases, so with the highest beta values, are all shrub-associated. So brown-headed cowbirds, fixuses, and Bell's vireos all tend to like it when there are more shrubs. And the species with the sharpest decreases are all these grassland specialists that need pristine grassland without a lot of woody vegetation in it. And so this does lend a little bit of credibility to the idea that woody encroachment is driving some of these declines. And next, I can show you the results of those using those nest data. So clutch size did not change over time. So the number of eggs in the nest was stable over time. The number of those eggs that survived to hatch also did not change. The number of those young that survived to fledge also did not change. And the daily survival rate, so kind of a combination of all these together, did not change over time. So fecundity overall didn't decrease, but there were some interesting patterns in those within nest drivers. So even though predation frequency overall didn't increase over time, it did increase for nests in species that prefer to nest in shrubs. And so there were more predators in the shrub areas. They were just only affecting these shrub nesting species first. Brood parasitism did become more frequent, so more nests were parasitized over time. But contrary to what I expected, this parasitism frequency increased more for species who are increasing and actually decreased for species who are decreasing. And this is the opposite of what I thought if an increase in parasitism is driving these declines. The frequency of brood parasitism also increased for birds who nest in shrubs. And so again, this seems like there are more cowbirds where there are more shrubs, and so it affected these shrub nesters most. And lastly, this parasitism frequency increased in unburned pastures and also in pastures that are grazed more frequently. And finally, cowbirds laid more eggs in nests that were in ungrazed pastures and nests that were in shrubs. So I realized that was a lot of individual graphs that I just showed you. So to kind of give a quick overview of what all those results mean, you can go back to this flowchart here and plug in what I now know from those results. So did this woody encroachment cause an increase in predators? Kind of. So it did increase predators for birds that like to breed in shrubs, but not for the others. But this increase in predators in shrub nests didn't result in an increase in complete predation. And so complete predation seems like it's not the explanation for these declines. I can just take that out. This increase in predators may have driven an increase in partial predation. I unfortunately wasn't able to look at that because most of the studies that measure partial predation at a fine enough scale took place much later, like after 2000. And so I couldn't look at that over the same temporal scale. But in either case, the partial predation frequency did not change the clutch size, number of eggs hatched, or the number of young fledged positively or negatively. And so it seems like partial predation, whether it changed or not, didn't drive these declines. And so it looks like whether predators increased or not in each area, it wasn't what's driving these declines, so I can get rid of that. I did see an increase in coverage. There were more coverage over time. And this does seem to have driven an increase in the frequency of root parasitism, but not the intensity. But even though there was an increase in frequency, this didn't seem to reduce these metrics of fecundity at all. So it looks like fecundity decreasing is not what's driving these declines. And even though there was an increase in coverage and the frequency of this parasitism, it doesn't seem to be connected to these declines at all. So I can get rid of that. So overall, my hypothesis that woody encroachment is driving these declines through a reduction in fecundity seems like it's just not true. There are some other potential ways that woody encroachment could affect these declines. The main one being an increase in emigration, so more birds leaving when conditions start to get worse. And this could happen through woody encroachment directly, or when it's severe enough to result in habitat loss, maybe the birds leave because there simply is an inward go on Konza. So overall, this reduced fecundity does not explain these local declines. I did see an increase in brood parasitism, but this didn't seem to have an effect on fecundity. But it's important to remember that woody encroachment in places where it's especially severe may represent habitat loss for these grassland species. So that was my first chapter. And one second. So now that again was a single site over really long temporal trends. And I want to look at a much broader spatial scale over some slightly shorter temporal scales to explain how weather influences differences in local abundance for grasshopper sparrows throughout the Great Plains. So again, we're still seeing these local declines for a lot of species, even though there wasn't a reduction in fecundity at Konza. And this may, again, be because as this habitat quality decreases with more woody encroachment, these birds just pick up and go somewhere else. And this makes sense in grasslands because, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, grasslands are really variable. If you look at these two photos, these are from the phenocam on Konza. And if you look really closely at these timestamps, see they're both from the 1st of May at around noon. And so these are the same time of year, same time of day, but they look really drastically different. And so this variability in grasslands means that birds need to move around a lot to find the resources they're looking for. And this lines up with a lot of previous research in a number of different birds and mammal species that suggest that low predictability in an ecosystem and high variability leads to animals moving around a lot in unpredictable ways. And unfortunately, systems that are really unpredictable and highly variable are often really hard to study because we also can't predict what is going to happen. And in a lot of systems, this isn't really an issue because in shrublands and forests, birds are typically site-faithful, meaning that they tend to return to the same place to breed every year when they migrate. And this is generally based on nest success. So if a bird is successful in a given location in a given year, they're more likely to return to that place the next year because conditions should be pretty similar. And this makes sense because then they don't have to waste a lot of energy and time looking for a new place to breed every year. But this doesn't seem to be true for grassland birds. So in some species, it can be as low as 2% of the individual birds return to the same place every year. And in most species, it's between 5 and 25%. So still much lower than those shrubland or forest birds. And from previous work we've done on Konza, we know that the site fidelity of grasshopper sparrows can vary widely among years, meaning that understanding these drivers of these settlement decisions can be especially difficult because not only are these birds not returning very often, you don't even know how many will return each year. And one driver of these settlement decisions at a really broad scale is weather. So again, a lot of you either currently or in the past have lived in Great Plains. And so you know that the weather here is really variable and really hard to predict. It can be cold and rainy one day and hot and sunny the next. And the same is true between years. So in some years, the breeding season for a bird will be really cold and wet and rainy, and other years it will be hot and dry. And these birds can't necessarily predict what conditions will be like in any given area. Some of these aspects of weather are pretty well studied for how they affect settlement decisions. We know that animals will seek out particular temperatures, and they're often willing to alter their behavior to help them thermoregulate and control these temperatures. Think like, for example, you going underneath a shady tree on a really hot day. And this makes sense because really high or really low temperatures can cause mortality, can kill these animals. And so making the right decision is really important. And we know this is true in grasshopper sparrows, especially on their wintering grounds, where lower temperatures tend to lead to lower survival. Another aspect that's pretty well studied is vegetation. We know that animals often select habitat with pretty similar vegetation structures. And again, this makes sense because the surrounding vegetation can influence how much risk they're at of predation or parasitism, and can therefore influence their nest success. But what we don't know is the relationship between weather and vegetation and these settlement decisions that birds are making. So we know that weather, either temperature or precipitation, influence vegetation growth. Generally, the more rain that falls, the more vegetation grows. And the growing season for plants generally starts after the last spring frost. But what we don't know very well is how these direct and indirect effects of weather can drive these settlement decisions that birds are making. So temperature could affect them directly, or both of these aspects of weather could affect them indirectly through their effects on vegetation. And this is generally really hard to study because for the most part, you need individual level data, which is really expensive and takes a lot of effort to collect. But I didn't have the funding or the time to do that. And so I need to figure out how to efficiently study these settlement decisions of a lot of individuals of a really large area. And to do that, I could take advantage of the fact that these differences in individual level settlement decisions can result in more broad scale differences in local abundance. So for example, if you have 3 sites, sites A, B, and C, and in one year, a bunch of birds are migrating north to breed. And in this first year, they spread out pretty evenly. And each site has about the same amount of birds. But in the next year, conditions have changed a little bit. Maybe site B is a little better, or sites A and C are a little worse. And so more of these birds go to site B than to sites A or C. So again, even though these changes are caused by individual level decisions, you can see the result on a much broader scale by these changes in local abundance. And so overall, my hypotheses for how weather could affect these settlement decisions. First, temperature could affect them directly through mortality. So again, over the winter, colder temperatures tend to lead to lower survival. And obviously dead birds aren't making any decisions anymore. And so I predicted that the colder these temperatures over the winter, the lower local abundances would be. Next, weather could affect these birds directly through thermoregulatory costs. So for example, if a bird shows up at the breeding site and it's really cold that year, maybe it's energetically cheaper for them to go somewhere else than it's for them to stay there and deal with those cold temperatures. And so for that, I predicted that colder temperatures in April during the peak of grasshopper sparrow migration would result in lower local abundance. And lastly, again, both of these aspects of weather could affect vegetation growth and through that indirectly affect these birds' decisions. And so for that, I predicted that the more rain that falls in a given area in the preceding year's growing season, the lower local abundance would be because the more plants would grow. And next, that a later start of the growing season would also result in lower local abundance because the further along the conditions are when these birds get there, the more informed decisions they can make about what conditions will actually be like during the breeding season. And so to test all this, I looked at the entire Great Plains of North America. And again, I studied grasshopper sparrows, which breed throughout the Great Plains and winter in northern Mexico and southern Texas, and then migrate back and forth every year. And using this entire region, I divided it into 400 individual cells. Each of these cells were 100 kilometers per side. I chose this size because of each of these aspects of weather, the most spatially variable one is precipitation. And this starts to meaningfully vary at a distance of around 100 kilometers. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, if I take, again, the entire Great Plains region, and I'll overlay one of these data files with each of these individual cells. And so when I'm talking about local abundance or local changes, I'm talking about the abundance or the changes within each of these individual cells. And so to do that, I used 11 years of data across the entire Great Plains. And again, obviously, I couldn't go and collect all these data myself. That would be exhausting. So I used citizen science data from eBird. eBird is this website where birders who like to go look at birds for fun can submit their observations to this site. And it both helps them keep track of what they've seen, and also later those data are made available to scientists like me. So I collected these data over the breeding season which for Grasshopper Sparrows is from May to July, over 11 years. And this added up to over 2.4 million observations. So it's a lot more than I would be able to collect myself, which is a big advantage of eBird data. But one disadvantage is that there are some forms of spatial bias that can happen. So these birds tend to go birding more often where other people have already gone birding. And so I can use data from eBird to account for that. And they also tend to go birding more often closer to cities or closer to roads because traveling is hard and takes time. And so to account for that, I use land cover data from the North American Land Change Monitoring System. And lastly, of course, I needed weather data. I got that from the Climate Prediction Center. So I took all those data sources and summarized each of those data points within each cell. So if I blow up a single cell, I can show you what that looks like. So again, I have my response, which is the total number of sparrows observed in each year during the breeding season, and several variables to account for that spatial bias, including the total number of observers who submitted checklists to eBird during each year, the total number of checklists submitted, and the total number of eBird hotspots. These are locations that could draw in birders from in other areas. And lastly, the total proportion of each cell covered by developed land. This includes cities and roads. And I had my predictors. So again, I was interested in interannual differences. So I included year in every model. Then 2 predictors each for each of my hypotheses. So for the mortality hypothesis, I included the mean and minimum winter temperatures across the wintering ground. For the thermoregulation hypothesis, I included the mean and minimum temperatures during April. So again, that's the peak of migration for the species. And for the vegetation hypothesis, I included the total amount of rain that fell during the preceding year's growing season. So this is May to September of the year before this migration is happening. And also the start date of the growing season, or the last frost in each year. And I used all these data and fit generalized additive models and used model selection to figure out which one of these hypotheses best explains the variation in these data. And so I'll show you the results of that here. So the important things to pay attention to here are the deviance explained, which is the total amount of the variation in these data that are explained by these graphs. So if I put all 3 models up here, you can see the model that explains the most variation is this vegetation hypothesis. If you're paying really close attention, you may notice that 4.9% or 49.1% and 48.6% aren't that different from one another. But again, it's important to remember here that I have a lot of data. So even 0.5% of it is still a massive amount of difference in what these hypotheses can explain. And from this top model, you can see what the actual effects of each of those variables were. If you look at this graph here, which is a little complicated, but you can see here on the x-axis is the start date of the growing season. And on the y-axis, this is the total amount of rain that fell in the preceding year's growing season. And the color is the predicted relative abundance of sparrows at a site at each intersection of those 2 variables. So the more yellow it is, the more sparrows we expect to be at an area with that amount of rain and where the growing season was that date. And in the bluer areas, there are fewer sparrows. So you can see there are 2 kind of key areas here. And first, you can notice that it tends to be more yellow lower down, which means that these birds tend to prefer less precipitation. And it also gets a lot bluer after March 1st. So birds prefer areas where there was less rain in the preceding year and where the growing season started before March. In addition, from this top model, I could look at some metrics of the variation in the overall distribution between years. So first, I calculated these centroids, which is essentially the center of mass of the total breeding distribution for each year. And then in this graph, this looks a little weird, but this is each of these breeding distribution centroids and the latitudinal and longitudinal distance that the centroid moved from the year before. So for example, you can see in 2014 here, this mouse will work. The centroid moved about 20 kilometers south and about 5 to 10 kilometers west from where it was in 2013. And so you can see overall in this graph, the distribution moved a lot. It moved up to 87 kilometers between years. But also importantly, this didn't always move in the same direction. So this isn't like an overall range shift where these birds are steadily moving north or something. They're tracking some resource that is variable between years. And another way to see that is in these rasters, which are again the predicted relative abundance spatially. And if you look really carefully at these, you can see some differences. So for example, in 2008, this area down here, which is actually around Manhattan, was a lot more yellow than it was in 2009. But it's kind of hard to make out very big differences here. So to show those differences more easily, I took each of these year rasters and subtracted it from the year following to get just the difference between each year. And so in this graph, the more yellow a site is, the more it increased from the year before. And the more blue it is, the more it decreased from the year before. So here again, you can see the breeding distribution changes quite a bit between years. And again, it's not always in the same direction. It's not as if there's one big source area, one big sink area. So this distribution is changing. And one interesting result of this study is that the most influential weather to explain migration comes well before that migration. So if you look at this timeline, migration is this little yellow box here. And the weather that explains where these birds go during migration comes from the precipitation in the preceding growing season, which is almost a year beforehand, and the start date of the growing season, which is several months beforehand. And these are what explains these settlement decisions during migration. One other really cool result from this is that a lot of previous research suggested that grassland birds are really sensitive to climate change. But importantly, the metric that they use to explain the sensitivity were generally things like local extinctions or range shifts, which again, if these birds are moving to track some resource, they may actually be moving around because they're resilient. So they're able to move around to track these different resources that they need. And that makes sense because these grassland birds are well adapted for variability. Grasslands in general are shaped by disturbances, by fire or grazing or weather. And these grassland birds have adapted to that by being able to move around. For example, we had local declines at a single site, but that wasn't explained by a decrease in fecundity, but probably because these birds were moving after those disturbances were suppressed in some areas. And this ties in pretty well to a lot of previous research on Konza. So there's been a lot of research saying that grassland plants and microbes are very resilient to disturbance and variability in the amount of rainfall or the temperature. And my results plug in well with this, showing that these birds are also resilient to these disturbances and especially to climatic variability. But they're resilient in a way that is hard to track at a single site because the fact that they're moving around means you have to be looking at them over larger spatial scales. And so my research has several implications for grassland bird conservation generally. Unlike in more stable systems like forests or shrublands that don't change that much between years, these grassland birds will move to seek out better conditions. And this is especially important because a lot of the general theories that we have about how bird biology works are based on forests. And so this suggests that grassland birds work fundamentally different in some ways. And second, this provides some evidence that grassland birds might be resilient to climate change. So even though the climate is predicted to become more variable and less predictable, these birds are well adapted for variability and unpredictability. And so they might actually be able to go somewhere else when the climate changes. And finally, that if you want to conserve grassland birds, you need to look at them over larger spatial scales rather than just a local site or two, because you need to think about grassland bird populations at the same level that these birds are, which again, if they're willing to move around a lot, is much larger than a single site. So finally, I'd like to thank all the people who helped me get this far. Most importantly, my advisor, Alice. She and Emily Williams gave me my first ever wildlife job back in 2014 and got me started on this path that led me here. And also everyone else in the oil lab who has listened to me complain a lot and helped me with code and with questions and all these problems that I've been having, and helped me to get to this point that I am today. And I also need to thank everyone at K-State in general, and especially the LTER, for both funding me and also giving me a cool place to work every summer. And finally, I need to thank my family, both of my parents who supported me throughout my desire to do science, even though they didn't really get it a lot of the time. And my siblings who only made fun of me a little bit for wanting to look at birds all day. And finally, my fiance, Sarah, who has been ridiculously supportive through all of this. I would not have been able to do this without them. With that, I can take any questions.